A small caliber bullet, barely heavier than a fingertip, became a battlefield trap, engineered to turn the human body into the epicenter of a ballistic nightmare. In 1974, the Soviet Union crossed a red line, trading sheer size for devastating internal chaos. The result was so unrelenting that the concept of a minor hit all but vanished. Wounds became unpredictable, catastrophic, and untreatable. What secret mechanism allowed a weapon this light to trigger localized biological collapse and force global armies to rethink the very meaning of combat? The answer begins with the poison bullet, and for those on its path, survival was never the same. Inside the 5.45 by 39mm cartridge, the secret to the so-called poison bullet lies not in its chemistry, but in its architecture. A cross-section reveals a design that seems almost surgical in intent. A slender copper jacket, a hardened steel penetrator core, and at the very tip, a hollow air pocket carved just behind the jacket, an empty space measuring about 5mm deep. This void is not an accident of manufacturing. It is the cartridge's defining feature, shifting the center of gravity rearward, away from the nose and toward the bullet's base. The result is a projectile that is perfectly stable in flight, but primed for chaos the instant it meets flesh. Ballistics scientists demonstrate this with a simple schematic. In the 7N6 and 7N10 variants, the hollow nose sits above a dense lead plug and steel core, concentrating nearly 70% of the bullet's mass behind its midpoint. When the projectile strikes soft tissue, the nose, light and hollow, slows rapidly, while the heavy rear end surges forward. This imbalance triggers a violent torque, pitching the bullet sideways within just 2 to 3 inches of penetration. High-speed footage from gelatin tests confirms the effect. The 5.45mm round begins to yaw and tumble almost immediately, its path twisting off axis, carving a serpentine wound channel that defies prediction. The cavity itself acts as a mechanical fuse. On impact, tissue fluid rushes into the air pocket, collapsing it and amplifying the bullet's instability. The steel core, once aligned for penetration, now becomes a plow, tearing through muscle, shattering bone, and grinding organs beyond the initial line of fire. Unlike the older 7.62mm round, with its solid lead tip and forward balanced mass, the 5.45mm round's engineered instability ensures that even a peripheral hit can become catastrophic. This is the anatomy of the trap, a bullet that transforms the human body into a kill zone, where the rules of survivability are rewritten not by size or speed, but by the calculated placement of a hollow void. The stage is set for a demonstration that will make the mechanism and its consequences impossible to ignore. Weight for the Soviet combat engineer was not just a logistical detail, it was a force multiplier. The switch from the 7.62mm cartridge to the 5.45mm cartridge cut the mass of each round by nearly a third. Where a soldier once carried 300 rounds, now he could shoulder close to 400 with the same burden. In the calculations of Soviet planners, this meant a platoon could sustain fire longer, maneuver farther, and blanket a wider front with lethal intent.
If you're enjoying this content, subscribe now.
The lighter round also brought a new kind of control. The AK-74's reduced recoil, almost half that of its predecessor, meant bursts could be held on target. Automatic fire became not just feasible, but doctrine. Soviet manuals from the mid-1970s codified this. Suppressive fire was no longer a desperate measure, but a primary tactic, enabled by the mechanical predictability of the new cartridge. A rifleman could unleash a stream of rounds with minimal muzzle climb, keeping enemies pinned or cut down at ranges where the old 7.62mm round would have scattered shots wide. This was the era of massed, sustained fire, volley after volley, delivered with a precision and density that overwhelmed traditional concepts of cover and maneuver. The doctrine did not shy from the reality of severe wounds. On the contrary, it accepted them as a calculated outcome. The 5.45mm round's high-velocity path, coupled with its engineered instability, meant that every hit, no matter how peripheral, carried the risk of catastrophic internal disruption. The idea of a minor hit faded from the Soviet battlefield lexicon. Logistically, the numbers told their own story. A standard AK-74 magazine, loaded with 30 of these slender rounds, weighed less than its 7.62mm counterpart by more than 200 grams. Multiply that by the loadout of a full squad, and the difference became a strategic advantage. More ammunition, more fire, more chances to trigger the mechanical horror that the 5.45mm round promised. In this new calculus, the human body was not just a target, but the final arena where Soviet doctrine played out its grim arithmetic. A ballistic scientist stands behind a block of clear gelatin, the AK-74's 5.45 by 39mm round chambered and ready. The shot cracks, and the projectile enters the gel with barely a ripple. Then, within less than 3 inches, the round yaws violently off-axis. High-speed footage reveals the transformation. A slender point becomes a spinning blade, twisting sideways as the bullet's heavy base overtakes its hollow nose. The yaw, measured at just 2.5 to 3 inches of penetration, is not a gradual drift, but a sudden mechanical betrayal of the bullet's own stability. Inside the gel, the temporary cavity balloons outward, reaching a peak width of 30 to 35 millimeters. For a fraction of a second, the clear medium distends as if struck by an invisible fist. The cavity is not a neat tunnel, but a gaping, irregular void. A mushroom-shaped wound channel that collapses almost as quickly as it forms. Tissue simulant surges into the air pocket at the round's tip, compressing the void and amplifying the bullet's instability. The steel core, now pitched sideways, becomes a plow, shearing through the medium in a serpentine path. The wound channel curves, doubles back and splits, defying the straight lines most soldiers and medics expect from a rifle shot. A forensic ruler pressed against the gel confirms that the 5.45mm round's yaw distance is less than half that of older 7.62mm rounds, which often travel 7 inches or more before tumbling. The difference is not just academic. The early yaw means the maximum destructive force is unleashed near the entry point, deep inside the torso or limb. The temporary cavity, 30 to 35 millimeters wide, represents a zone of shredded vessels, ruptured organs, and instant localized biological collapse. This is the ballistic nightmare at the heart of the so-called poison bullet, a mechanism that turns a small caliber round into a trap, where the human body itself becomes the final arena for mechanical horror. The scientist, reviewing the footage frame by frame, points out the threshold where order gives way to chaos. The red line is crossed not by chemical poison, but by physics, a rearward center of gravity, a hollow void, and a split second of yaw that erases the distinction between a glancing hit and a mortal wound. The demonstration leaves no doubt. What enters as a minor puncture can become a catastrophic event, rewriting the rules of survivability with every shot. Field hospitals in Afghanistan quickly learned that the 5.45 by 39mm round was rewriting the rules of trauma care. Where medics once expected clean entry and exit wounds, they now faced patients pouring blood from jagged, unpredictable channels. The numbers told a grim story. Average blood loss from a single 5.45mm wound reached 1.2 liters, a volume that could tip a healthy soldier into shock within minutes. Mortality in the first half hour rose to 18%, an increase that haunted evacuation teams who raced against the clock but found that even rapid intervention often came too late. Autopsy reports collected by Soviet military doctors revealed the mechanism behind these statistics. The early yaw and tumbling of the projectile meant that internal organs were not just pierced, but torn, lacerated, and ground apart. Surgeons described finding liver and lung tissue shredded far from the bullet's path, as if the round had detonated inside the body. The wound channels themselves were rarely straight. Instead, they curved and doubled back, slicing through vessels and nerves in ways that made hemorrhage control nearly impossible. Tourniquets and field dressings, once reliable tools, could not keep up with the relentless internal bleeding unleashed by the temporary cavity's collapse. Evacuation logs from the Afghan campaign recorded a new and troubling average: 22 minutes to reach a field hospital, 6 minutes longer than for casualties hit by the older 7.62mm round. Those lost minutes often decided the outcome. For trauma medics, the shift was clear. There were no longer any minor hits. Every wound carried the threat of catastrophic collapse. One Soviet medic, quoted in a 1985 field report, described the experience as a negotiation with the limits of biological endurance. The disappearance of survivable wounds changed the rhythm of battlefield medicine. Triage became an exercise in futility as more casualties arrived with injuries that left little hope. The poison bullet's true horror was not in its chemistry, but in its ability to erase the fragile line between injury and death, turning the body's own tissue into the final trap. The name spread in whispers, first among Afghan mujahideen, then through Soviet ranks, and finally across entire front lines. It became known as the poison bullet. It was never an official designation, but a battlefield mythos born from wounds that refused to obey the rules of war. Stories circulated of men struck in the arm or leg, only to collapse minutes later, organs failing from injuries hidden deep within. The nickname carried a promise. No part of the body was safe, and no hit could be dismissed as minor. Veterans recall the change in how soldiers moved and fought. One survivor, his voice brittle with memory, describes the moment he realized the rules had changed. You heard the shot, you felt the sting, and you waited for the pain to fade. But it didn't. It grew. I watched a friend, hit in the side, try to crawl to cover. He made it 3 meters before his breathing stopped. The fear was not just of death, but of the unknown. The 5.45mm round's reputation turned every skirmish into a test of nerve. Soldiers began to hug the earth, avoiding even the shallowest exposure. The old faith in light cover, in rocks, brush, and the thin skin of a vehicle crumbled. Even a glancing hit could mean catastrophic internal damage. Field reports noted a drop in aggressive maneuvers and a rise in hesitation at the sound of enemy fire. The psychological effect was measurable. Morale dipped, units hesitated, and the myth of the poison bullet became as potent as the wound itself. In this new reality, the line between survival and collapse had vanished, replaced by a lingering dread that any round, no matter how small, could trigger the body's final trap. NATO intelligence analysts, confronted by the mounting evidence from Afghanistan, assembled their own teams of ballistics experts and medical consultants. In a classified 1981 memo circulated among Western defense ministries, one analyst described the 5.45 by 39mm cartridge as a mechanical trap, not for its chemical composition, but for the way it defeated the logic of survivability. The early yaw and unpredictable wound channels forced a re-evaluation of what counted as adequate protection on the battlefield. Armor specifications changed first. Declassified NATO briefs from 1982 detail urgent upgrades to soft body armor, raising standards to National Institute of Justice Level 3A and mandating new aramid fiber blends. The goal was not simply to stop penetration, but to disperse the force of yaw-induced cavities and limit the internal trauma that followed. Hard plate designs were revised as well, thickening back face layers to absorb the blunt force of a tumbling steel core. These changes appeared in procurement documents within 2 years of the first AK-74 field reports. a rare pace for military bureaucracy. Infantry doctrine shifted in parallel. By 1984, Western manuals advised soldiers to maintain engagement distances greater than 400 meters when facing AK-74 fire, exploiting the round's reduced yaw and lethality at range. Training exercises began to emphasize rapid casualty extraction and immediate tourniquet use for wounds with massive cavitation, even when external bleeding seemed minimal. Tactical briefings warned that light cover could no longer be trusted. The myth of the poison bullet had become a factor in operational planning. Legal reviews followed. Internal NATO findings concluded that despite the round's behavior that resembled expansion, the 5.45 by 39mm cartridge did not violate the Geneva Convention. Its wounding mechanism depended on physics, not prohibited expansion. Still, the paper trail of memos, procurement orders, and doctrinal changes revealed the global ripple effect of a cartridge engineered to erase the boundary between minor injury and biological collapse. Internal documents from the Izhmash factory, dated between 1971 and 1974, lay bare the intent behind the 5.45 by 39mm cartridge's most infamous feature. A production memo stamped with the Tasnai Tok Mash Bureau seal spells it out in clinical language. The design shall maximize incapacitation per gram of ammunition. That phrase, buried in a matrix of technical requirements, makes clear that the hollow nose and rearward center of gravity were not accidents. They were the product of deliberate engineering. Quality control records from the same period reveal just how exacting the process became. Each air cavity was measured with a micrometer, held to a tolerance of plus or minus 0.1 millimeter. Even a tenth of a millimeter deviation could shift the yaw onset by a measurable margin. Too shallow and the round tumbled late. Too deep and it risked structural failure or premature fragmentation. An Izhmash engineer, interviewed decades later, recalled the pressure to find the sweet spot where the bullet would always betray its own flight path inside the target. Batch logs tracked the results. Rounds with a cavity of precisely 5mm produced the most consistent yaw at 2.5 to 3 inches of penetration. This was not guesswork. It was a calculated manipulation of physics, biology, and fear. The manufacturing process became a kind of controlled experiment, each lot of ammunition a new test in the mechanics of human vulnerability. In the words of one surviving memo, the round was to be mechanically primed for maximum effect in soft tissue. The evidence leaves little doubt. This was a bullet built not only for the battlefield, but for the anatomy of the body itself. Defense analysts, sifting through the aftermath of the introduction of the AK-74, found themselves confronting a new reality in the calculus of combat. The 5.45 by 39mm cartridge, with its engineered instability and capacity for catastrophic internal damage, forced a reckoning across military doctrines. The idea of a survivable wound, once a cornerstone of battlefield medicine and morale, was quietly abandoned. Reports from Afghanistan, Angola, and Ethiopia described patterns of injury that defied established triage protocols. Wounds that appeared superficial on entry but unraveled into spirals of hemorrhage and organ destruction, overwhelming even the most seasoned medics. The numbers told a story of their own. Average evacuation time stretched, mortality in the first half hour climbed, and the threshold for what could be treated in the field narrowed to a vanishing point. In closed-door briefings, Western defense planners acknowledged that traditional body armor and engagement tactics were no longer sufficient. The mechanical horror of the poison bullet had rewritten what it meant to be protected. Procurement documents from the early 1980s show a wave of urgent upgrades, armor standards revised, trauma protocols rewritten, and tactical doctrines adjusted to account for a threat that blurred the line between a glancing hit and a mortal wound. Analysts noted that the psychological impact was just as profound as the physical. The mythos of the poison bullet seeped into operational planning, eroding confidence in cover and shaking the faith soldiers once placed in their own resilience. Calls for greater transparency in reporting, wound patterns, and medical outcomes echoed through defense circles. Archival records, once sealed, were scrutinized for clues that might help mitigate the round's effects. The doctrine of survivability, once rooted in predictable injury and recovery, now rested on an uncertain foundation. In the shadow of the AK-74's mechanical trap, the rules of war had been redrawn, leaving behind a legacy of permanent doctrinal reassessment and an enduring sense of unease. Today, the blueprint for the so-called poison bullet still shadows global warfare. Its legacy is not just in twisted wound channels, but in the enduring anxiety that no soldier is ever truly safe from localized biological collapse. As nations refine small-caliber lethality, the mechanical horror of a single round continues to erase the line between survivable and catastrophic. Sometimes, the smallest trap leaves the deepest scar.
If you're enjoying this content, subscribe now.